Hi, Misha here, and I'm waiting on FedEx, so since you guys seem to at least enjoy them, let's do another collection video. And this time, let's talk about rifles of Deutschland, of Germany. Pretty much 20th century, a little into the 19th, and a little into the 21st, but mostly the 21st. And so we will cover the original Gover 88 Commission rifle, then the original Gover 98 Mauser, then its little brother, the Kar.98, and then one of my strangely favorite ones, the Cartridge. And then of course get into some K.98Ks. And then we'll get into their self-loading guns. We've got a Gover 41, one of my Gover 43s, or actually this is a Kar 43. Of course, we have to talk about the most important German gun, perhaps, the STG 44. And then we'll move into the Cold War period with West Germany's G1 and G3, East Germany's MPI series, and then of course end with their unification with the G.36, which is still, despite efforts to replace it, the standard issue gun as of mid-2020. So with that, let's just jump in and begin with Germany's very first smokeless powder infantry rifle. Alright, let's begin at the beginning with the Gover 88. Specifically, this is of course a Gover 8805, a G.88 often called a commission rifle. This is not a Mauser. Paul Mauser had nothing to do with this. In fact, his company did not even make these. However, this was Germany's first military issue smokeless powder rifle, and it did fire an early forerunner of the 8mm Mauser round, still in pretty widespread use today. It had an interesting history, but its service, at least front line, was very brief because, like most first-generation smokeless rifles, technology progressed past it rapidly. But also, like most early generations, it was brought back into service for emergency use during the first couple of years of World War I, and then made its way around the world to places like Turkey, China, etc. So, yeah, of course, as you know, 1886, the French shocked the world by releasing the very conventional Lebel Rifle, as it's known, although it's not a Lebel Rifle, but I digress. And it fired the revolutionary, for the time, 8mm Lebel smokeless powder cartridge. Smokeless powder has many benefits over black powder, not just easier cleaning, but it also gave much better performance, better range, much better accuracy more consistently, less bore erosion, at least if the bores were made properly. And of course, it was cleaner, producing far less smoke. Now, we think today it's kind of funny, it's called smokeless powder, and there's decidedly smoke, but if you look at an old black powder gun from the 19th century, this is practically no smoke to them. It was a big step forward. And one person firing a gun's one thing, but when you have hundreds or thousands or even tens of thousands of soldiers firing, you can imagine how much black smoke was generated. So, in April of 1888, the still young nation of Germany established a commission to develop a rifle to counter the French, and it needed to fire a new smokeless powder round. Now the round itself originally was 8mm, but it was a round-nosed bullet. But it was a revolution in the sense that it was a rimless casing. The French 8mm round was a rimmed casing, much like a Mauser Nagant fires. This is rimless. It's a big step forward in a lot of ways. And originally it used a Mannlicher style packet on-block loading system. 5 rounds, feed them from the top. The bolt action was pretty straight copied, although not entirely so, from Germany's previous service rifle, the Gover 71 and Gover 7184. Now that was designed by Mauser, but this wasn't. This was of course scaled down, updated some. In fact, Mauser was not all that pleased with being left out of this design and yada yada. It's a pretty conventional bolt, although it is a two-piece design with a removable bolt head, which is kind of unique. The rifle version was just right at 49 inches long with a 29-inch barrel and weighed about 8.5 pounds. Probably its most unique feature was this jacket made of sheet steel, which was an early attempt to free float the barrel, to keep the barrel from making contact with the forearm to try to improve accuracy and consistency. Had standard adjustable sights. No upper handguard because we have the shroud. Pretty standard sling swivel. Cleaning rod under the barrel. Pretty standard straight stock. In one interesting feature of the Gover 88, it has a QD style rear swivel. So Uncle Mike's was not the first. And of course the steel butt plate. These were put into production in 1889 and ultimately would be made at 4 state arsenals, and some private firms would also contribute. And they would build just under 3 million rifles, and they would build about 300,000 carabiner 88s, a carbine version. Very similar, except it had a shorter 19-inch barrel, thus a shorter overall length of about 37 inches. It was quite a bit lighter at about 7 pounds, and it did not have the barrel shroud to save weight. It also had a turned-down, kind of dished bolt handle. So yeah, these were going into service in the 1890s, but it was a rocky road at first. They didn't have a lot of experience with the new smokeless powder round. They had problems with barrels bursting, rapid erosion, just other quality control issues, so much so that there was a bit of a scandal where some in the government accused Jewish owners of factories of intentionally sabotaging the line, but through a hearing this was found to be totally false, and in fact the accusers were prosecuted instead. It wasn't until around 1895 they kind of got their act together. They redid the bore a bit, they kind of reworked some of the production, and the quality would be stepped up quite a bit later in production. Flipping her over, not a whole lot different to see on this side. You can see the bolt handle. This one has a couple of Turkish markings because a lot of these ended up in Turkey. So what about the 8805 variant? Well, of course, in 1898, the new Mauser model 98 was adopted and would soon replace this. In fact, production would be over by 1900, and the Mauser would start replacing these in frontline units pretty rapidly. And then in 1903, again following a French innovation, the Germans would go from the round-nosed 8mm bullet to a new Spitzer pointed tip 8mm bullet. It was pretty easy to rework the 98 to fire this, and it was plenty strong. But the 88 Commission rifle was right on the cusp of what it could take, but it was able to fire the new round just barely. These became the 88S, S for Spitzer. And then soon the 8805 came out, and the difference there, these were altered. They got away from the packet system, and they cut them to take Mauser style stripper clips. If I can do this on hand, I will do this. You can do it one-handed. And they added a magazine internally. It's a very smooth bolt on these, I will give it that. Now this bottom plate, sheet steel plate that looks added on, is exactly that. The hole was only plugged in World War I. That was a very late addition. They also recalibrated the sights with the 05 model. And so they converted some 1888s to the new pattern for second line use. However, when World War I kicked off, they converted another 500,000 of them, and some people call these an 88/14. Other people just lump them in with the 8805, so take your pick. They were very much heavily used in 1914 and 1915, but by 1916, though, really Germany had enough newer rifles, so most of these were retired, maybe given to allies, or at the very least just put into storage for emergency use. The commission rifle is exactly what you'd expect. It was designed by a German commission. A bureaucratic commission, is already that. Can you imagine a German bureaucratic commission? I'll be honest with you, I can't. I'm surprised they made a gun as quickly as they did, and one that actually works. But that said, it had some major shortcomings, and you could tell that it was a rush job, something designed just to say Germany had a modern rifle. This barrel jacket, while the idea was sound, maybe in theory, it doesn't play out in practice. It allowed moisture or anything else to get in between the barrel, and there's no good way to clean it, so it often led to erosion, and just, yeah, not good. And like I said, for the first few years of production, they had some quality control problems, side bayonet mount. And the action, since it was kind of taken from the Mauser 71, 7184, really wasn't as strong as what would come later. But it is an important part, and Germany's not alone in this first generation of them being in and out of service quite quickly. And they very much made up for it with what came next. The Gover 98, the adopted name of Paul Mauser's Model 98, is without a doubt one of the most widespread and influential firearms of the 20th century, and was a revolutionary step forward in bolt-action guns. After the commission rifle, up here, Mauser started working on refining a design and doing smokeless powder. Already by 1889, he had his first pattern, which went to Belgium. This would, basically be an early version of the 1891 Argentinian rifle, It would be updated again, 1893 for the Spanish, and again in 1895, and then it would really did the 1896 Swedish. And throughout all these updates, many things were changed and perfected. So by the time of the German militaries, 1898, whereas the commission rifle had been a rush job, this rifle had been in development and had seen real field use for a decade. And originally they considered going to a 6mm cartridge. They also considered just updating the Commission rifle. So there's a lot of back and forth between 1896 and 1898 in Germany. But then in April of that year, they just selected the new Mauser design. At that time, Louvre became DWM a couple of years earlier, and production was set up. They placed an initial order, and the first time these saw combat was in 1901 during the Boxer Rebellion. And from there, production moved forward. After this kind of early test, they would start putting in major production with major orders by 1904. And at the start of World War I, the German military had over 2.25 million Model 98s in their inventory. And then, of course, with the war, production would be well ramped up, and a total of 11 factories would build these at some point, the 4 state arsenals and 7 private firms. So to say they were mass-produced is quite the understatement. They would make around 7 million in World War I. So what makes the Mauser so advanced? Its barrel is pretty conventional, really. Originally, very briefly fired the round nose cartridge, but quickly was updated for the new Spitzer. The main feature of the 98 is its bolt. It is extremely safe. It's a controlled feed. It uses a flush 5-shot magazine with the quick removable floor plate for cleaning and also just emptying the rifle safely. The original version had these unique sights that we call roller coaster sights, because at this time they were thinking long range. And it did have a short upper handguard at the front of the barrel exposed. Again, a cleaning rod under the barrel. Unlike the Gover 88, the barrel lug is now on the underside, but it's this new style that's famous for a lot of World War II guns. We have a new style of semi-pistol grip stock that will start to be used on these, and we have the same kind of QD rear swivel as we saw on the Commission rifle. Flipping it over. Size-wise, they're really about the same, both 49 inches, 29-inch barrel. The Mauser is just a teensy hair longer, and I mean just a little bit. But it does weigh more. A lot of it has to do with the stock, the beefier action. This was the first really to have Mauser's cock on open, large ring design, very strong, like I said. And they would make some changes during production. They would get rid of the stock disc and go to the takedown donut that we know. They would also add finger grooves, grasping grooves to the stock. They would sometimes use different wood, beech, walnut, what have you. But really, considering 9 million total were made, around 2 million before the war and 7 million during the war, it was pretty unchanged, frankly, all things considered. So they were really cranking these out in 1915 and 1916, but then in 1917 they scaled back production in favor of newer projects like the Luger and the upcoming MP18. In fact, some factories ceased making Gover 98s in the last year of the war in the first place. So, and while definitely quality went down during World War I, they still maintained a high standard. It never got as rough as things would get for World War II. And much like with the Commission rifles before, a lot of German Gover 98s would end up in Turkey and elsewhere around the world. Because even after the end of World War I, there were millions of these in service and in existence, so a lot would be done with them. But I really like World War I 98s. The Lange, the roller coaster sights are just neat. Long barrel. And you just don't commonly encounter these as much as you do K98s, even though they tend to bring more money. The K98, I mean. Well, let's look at some 98 variants. This is one of my favorite German guns, and it's actually a topic I'm very interested in. The Kar.98, later retroactively renamed the Kar.98A, and erroneously often called the Kar.98AZ in America, which is only sort of correct. So here we have a World War I Mauser Carbine. But before we talk about it, we need to talk about this. Now, this is not a German. I wish it was. This is a Spanish Cavalry Carbine model 1895. But it's a good example of what was happening in that era. They would typically have a long rifle with the barrel between 29 and 31 inches, and then a short carbine, cavalry carbine, with a barrel between about 17¾ inch and 19.5 inches, depending on the nation and the model. The quote-unquote short rifle concept was really in its infancy. And right after the adoption of the 1898 rifle in 1899, so the following year, work began on a carbine version to replace the Kar.88. Unlike some other guns, say the Schmidt-Rubin 1889, or the Lebel, for that matter, 1886, they saw no problems making the Mauser 98 into a carbine. So, troop trials were held for a couple of years, until about 1901. Some pre-production rifles, or carbines I should say, were made, and they were put into the field in kind of full production by 1903. And the first version of the Kar.98 was based on kind of the common Mauser pattern here, meaning it would have a 17.7 inch barrel and an overall length of just shy of 37.5 inches. The original Kar.98 was a standard large ring Mauser action, firing the 8mm at the time round nose bullet. Well, of course, once the Spitzer round came in 1905, they reworked the Kar.98 to fire it, which at first seemed like a simple prospect, but it wasn't. Once they reworked it for the more powerful round, they realized that it was pretty hideous to shoot out of a gun with a less than 18-inch barrel. Recoil, noise, sound, flash, everything was just, it was an unpleasant gun to shoot, and therefore soldiers didn't like shooting it. Therefore, in 1906, Kar.98 Cavalry Carbine production was suspended, and a commission was established to work on ways to improve it. At this point, they had built around 20,000. So not a tiny number, but not huge. So this is where this rifle steps in. Originally, with the first pattern, they often didn't have a bayonet lug, although they would trial versions with either a bayonet lug or a stacking swivel, depending on if it was for artillery or cavalry. And at first, with the new pattern, they thought to do the same. But then they would standardize and just have both, bayonet lug and stacking swivel, piling swivel, what have you. The biggest difference, they went to a longer barrel. It's 23¼ inches. So what we would really think of as a short rifle, but other countries, including the US, with like the Craig, considered a 22-inch barrel still carbine, so it was right on that line. They went to a new protected front sight. There's no cleaning rod under the barrel. They went to a full-length upper handguard. They went to side sling mounts versus the bottom style. A new kind of flat, more recognizable pattern of rear sight. One interesting thing, they went to a small ring receiver design. They also moved the trigger and trigger guard a little bit. And they went to a slightly longer stock because of it, because they pushed the trigger forward. It gave a slightly longer length to pull. Notice it has the disc in the stock, and it has the now pretty iconic pass-through sling mount in the back. Of course, flat butt plate, and it has a turn-down bolt handle we'll look at when I flip it over. Now they would try out several versions, prototypes produced between 1906 and 1907, finally adopting this pattern in January of 1908. Now, when this was a prototype, the designation 98AZ was used. Basically, it meant Carbine 98 model with both bayonet lug and stacking rod, because other prototypes had have different prototype designations, kind of like how America uses XM for a lot of guns. But when it was adopted, it was just known as the Carabiner 98, Kar.98, or sometimes in some places and times just simplified to K.98. But military documents and inscriptions written on the guns themselves never use the AZ suffix. It became popular in America because it was printed in a few books, and it doesn't exactly seem to be what I'd call a misprint. I mean, the name did exist, but it seems to be kind of a misreading of German documents. And I say that having pulled some original German documents and a few years ago, submitting them to a couple of German speakers I know. So I'm not saying I'm conclusively right, but I am saying I have looked into it quite a bit. Anywho, the Kar.98, the effective short rifle version, it's now just a hair under 43 inches long. So still shorter than the rifle, which is still 49. But again, much longer than 37.5 inches. The old carbines were kind of retired to second line use. Many were sent to the colonies in Africa where they were used up. So very few actually saw service in World War I. And those that did, it would have been early on, like 1914. Flipping them over. The bolt handle is turned down, but it's kind of unique in that it's checkered underneath and flat. Notice the stock is not inletted as much as on some later guns. So between that and the flat bolt handle, you can still get your hand under it to operate it. Older ones like this would not have any inletting at all and a round bolt, so certainly harder to use. So yeah, this was standardized in 1908. It was produced only at the government arsenals, the government factories, not at private ones. And they would produce them on and off before World War I, and then heavily until 1917, 1918, building quite a large number, around 1,500,000. And these are very popular, as you could understand, with cavalry, artillery, but most importantly, those going over the top in trench raids and stuff. Not as light and handy as the original carbine, true, but much more useful with the newer Spitzer cartridge. Far less flash and felt recoil, a little bit quieter, a little bit more accurate, a little more effective range because of a longer sight radius. And they did what they could to help with the weight. For example, going to the small ring receiver and whatnot. It's not a terribly heavy gun. But yeah, it was quite popular, and it really showed that an intermediate gun could be used for all kinds of things, and that you didn't need a specific carbine model for different sectors of the military, that a standardized gun actually could be a good idea. Not with the M14 in America, but in, World War I and later World War II Germany, it worked out pretty well. So it's still known as the Kar.98 at the end of World War I. The name Kar.98A, while never stamped on the guns themselves, started to be used in paperwork in 1923, and then thus retroactively applied to those that were still in German Weimar Republic, as it would be, service. And that kind of rolls us on to our next chapter in German rifles and the Mauser. Okay, as we move into Nazi territory, as Churchill called them, or Nazis, as Luke Skywalker calls them, I'm going to start interjecting as many cat clips as I can find. I figure that's the best thing to do to counterbalance Nazism. Cats or puppies, but I don't have any puppy pictures. Wish I had videos of my old guide dog prints. I put those in, but I don't think I do. Oh look, if I do, I'll put one in. Anyway, let's move on. Earl! In a way, the Kar.98B is a very minor footnote in history, but it actually was the immediate forefather of the Kar.98K. Yeah, the Kar.98A was not, believe it or not. And the Kar.98B, which is why the 98A was renamed 98A, was kind of patterned in 1923 and produced in small numbers between 1924 and 1931 approximately. If this looks like the Gover 98, you are not wrong. The Treaty of Versailles placed severe limits on the number of rifles that Germany could have, but not as much on carbines. And at that time, it was kind of considered that they were still that old 19th century mindset that a longer barrel equaled more range and thus a more deadly gun. So, what Weimar Germany did, they just renamed the Gover 98 to a Karabiner 98. All they really changed, they went to the turn-down bolt handle, dished the receiver out for it. Now this bolt handle is round underneath, not tapered. They added the pass-through sling swivel here, and they went to a new flat tangent sight. But otherwise, it's like a wartime or late production 98. Still has 29-inch barrel, overall length of 49 inches, and weighs maybe a teensy bit lighter just because of the new sight, but yeah. And it was a large ring, of course, not a small ring, and it had the trigger guard in the standard position, not pushed forward like on the A here. Now, the only factory allowed to build these, or at least one of the few factories allowed to build guns, was Simpson. And it's estimated that they turned out roughly 70,000. And these would be used to supplement older World War I era rifles that Germany was allowed to have for essentially self-defense, self-protection. Just flipping it over briefly, show you the other side. Pretty standard. See, it has the sling bar from the 98A, and really the rear sight is very clearly inspired by the 98As. But the bayonet lug and cleaning rod are decidedly from the original. Notice there's still no sight protector grooves on the front side there. H-band. There would also be another model known as the Gover 98M, which was the same as the Gover 98, but it had the newer pattern of flat rear sight, but still a straight bolt handle. And there would be some transitional and stuff, and markings on the Kar.98B would vary widely. Now, while the military referred to them as 98Bs, they could be marked Kar.98, Kar.98, Gover 98, even Mod 98 laid on. But yeah, it was just basically a way to circumvent limits placed on rifles and carbines in the Versailles Treaty system. Which is interesting because it shows at the time they really thought having a long barrel was still worth a minor subterfuge, because they could have easily made these with the 23-inch barrel. But in the 1920s, the Germans still thought they wanted to go long. Of course, by 1933, you know who came to power with his sycophants, and once Hitler and the Nazis were in, they really quickly just took the Treaty of Versailles, ripped it up into strips, and used it as toilet paper. So after that, they felt pretty free to do what they want. Peanut, the tripod, and my buddy cat that's usually very nearby and just really loves to cuddle. But don't get in her way, or she will whop you with her one paw, and she's not afraid to do it. How are you, girl? One of the first things that the German government, German military did after this was to update the old 8mm cartridge to a new version. This was designed to have a little less flash, work better out of shorter barrels, just generally speaking deliver better performance. And then in early 1934, they ordered that a new rifle pattern be adopted. Some wanted to really focus on self-loading rifles, while others, more traditionalists and also maybe more penny pinchers, were content with the bolt action. And in June of 1935, these would be the winners. They would push forward and get a new pattern of Mauser. The one you all know, the Carabiner 98 Kurs, the Kar.98K. And that always seemed like a strange name when I was young, because Carbine Model 98 short. Well, that is because it's not developed from the Kar.98A. Really, it isn't. It is developed from the Kar.98B. So even though the 98B was only produced in small numbers, it really did influence something that we produced around 14 million in World War II. They took the gun that has the pass-through slingshots, the donut flat butt plate originally, has the same large ring action, turn down bolt, oops, broke, flat tangent type rear sight, short upper handguard with exposed barrel, front band, standard lug, cleaning rod, and originally, just like the D, it would have an unprotected front sight. Really, the only difference had a shorter barrel. This barrel is a little bit longer than the carbine here, at about 23.6 inches. And because this doesn't have the receiver changes of the A, the overall length of the gun is just a little under 44 inches. But still 5 inches shorter than the original rifle. They also made efforts to modernize, streamline, cheapen mass production as well. And they started cranking these out en masse by 1936, although there are some early transitional models from 34 and 35. And early on they did some little tricky things to try to hide the production. In fact, the S in S42, which was Mauser, was actually supposed to kind of fool people into thinking it still was coming from Simson. In reality, the Simson factory was confiscated by the Nazis because the owners had the misfortune to be Jewish in 1930s Germany. But yeah, by the late 30s, this was standard issue and being produced in more and more factories. And as they would occupy other nations, they would put the Kar.98K into production there as well. Not to go too deep into the Kar.98K, because literally there haven't just been books, but series written on this gun, with, like I said, 14 million produced in several nations: Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, not to mention other places like Yugoslavia, Poland. It is worth pointing out that the Kar.98K at least received inspiration, if not outright influence, from the very successful Czech VZ-24 short rifle, another Mauser. By the interwar period, the 98 pattern had really spread throughout Europe, into South America, into Africa, and even was seeing quite a bit of use in China. And of course, anything in China is going to have unlicensed copies made. Even Japan used some VZ-24s. There were a number of variations in production changes. Early on, they would use solid wood stocks, usually walnut. In 1937, they would introduce an easier, cheaper to produce, and also stronger laminated stock. Now here I've got an early production gun. I think it's 1936 was this one. And up here I have a good old Russian Capture, 1941, which I picked. This one's a Steyr production. I like the Russian Captures, I've said that before. They were really good values, great shooters, and they had their own collector interest. And then up here we have another Steyr. This is a Krieg's model, people's model, late war simplifications. And they would. First they would make some things like the stock change. They would also add a front sight protector around 1940, 1941, depending on the factory. Early guns like this won't have notches for the front sight. The cleaning rods would actually change quite a bit. Different lengths, different diameters, so that happened. Bayonet lugs stayed pretty much the same. Short upper handguard. Another change early on, they went from the original flat butt plate to the cupped style. Just all around better. It reinforced the stock, gave the toe of the gun a little more strength for using as a club. The donut would get slightly bigger. All kinds of little changes like that. But then, of course, as the war turned against Germany, they would start introducing a lot of economic measures. Probably most noticeably, they went to stamped parts. Stamped barrel band like this here, here. Stamped trigger guard and floor plate. Later they even take this even further. Instead of using a spring to hold the barrel bands on, they would screw them on, and then they would delete the bayonet lug, cleaning rod, even the front sight protector usually wouldn't be installed. They'd still keep the adjustable rear sight though. They would simplify the vent holes in the bolt a bit. They would do away with the takedown disc in the stock, going to a small hole in the butt plate to disassemble the bolt with. And they would go from a blued finish, early on very high polish, then later a military blued, and then finally they would start using phosphating, first for small parts, and then later they would have some guns that were entirely phosphated. All in an effort to keep production up and work with dwindling resources. Flipping these over, you can see the screws holding the barrel bands on. There's also a screw holding the metal end cap on. And while the machining would never reach Japanese levels, in 1945 they were doing less polishing and leaving markings clearly visible. They would be totally shameful to earlier Germans. Another thing, the guns originally had what were called capture screws. This had been a feature since the beginning. These held the large screws in. They would eliminate all of that by the end as well, not even having a spot for the screws. All kinds of little changes. They would even have a few factories that would try a simplified stamped rear sight, but those are very late war. Some of the very late war, if you want to call them last ditch guns, have some very interesting features, we'll call them. Sure. But early Kar.98Ks had typical German fit and finish. The gun was known to work extremely well in all environments, including the Russian front. It's actually why Russia ended up capturing quite a few with an eye towards reissuing them, if and when there was ever a war with America. The reason I like Russian capture guns, you know, especially earlier ones like this, they saw something. They were in a battle. After the war, Russia would stamp them with an X to show that they were captured. The X is actually supposed to be crossed sabers. It's literally just an X though. And then later on still, they would refinish them, applying kind of an oil finish to the stock with the shellac over that, and then kind of applying a really dark industrial blue to the metal parts. And much like after World War I, having so many rifles left over, they really scattered to the four corners. For example, many found their way to Israel, which is a whole story in and of itself that we've done a complete video just on that. Many more ended up in Yugoslavia, Romania, anywhere and everywhere. And of course, yeah, the Russian guns. And they would even remain in German service, be it West or East German, through the 40s and 50s, because at that time, Germany was not allowed to produce firearms. And that sounds like a good stopping point for part 1. In part 2, we'll look at self-loading and select fire guns, first in the Nazi era and then in the Cold War era for both West and East Germany. So that'll be coming up soon. Love to hear about your own Mausers. Feel free to comment. And as always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I will catch you very soon next time. Alright, I think it's a good idea to break this into 2 parts at this point. I am obviously not averse to long videos, but yeah. Hey, don't blame us. The YouTube algorithm now gives kind of preference to videos that are over 15 minutes, so an hour is going to be 4 times as good, right? No, in part 2, we'll get into the self-loading and then, of course, select fire of World War II, and then we'll see how that led directly to the Cold War era. So with that, if you have any questions or comments, or would like to share your own German bolt-action stories or guns, we'd love to do that below. As always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. And if you would like to help support the channel, please click the link and check out our Patreon page. And with that, be back very soon with part 2 next time.